Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie, Moab Investigation, Part 4. Dispatch assistance. All calls of domestic violence, including incomplete 911 calls, should be dispatched as soon as possible. Dispatchers are not required to verify the validity of a court order before responding to a request for assistance. Officers should request that dispatchers check whether any of the involved persons are subject to the terms of a court order. The incident was reported as a domestic violence incident. Officer Robbins handled the investigation and obtained the identifying information from Brian and Gabby. It's common practice to run individuals through dispatch to check for warrants, protective orders, and driver's license information. Officer Robbins only asked dispatch for a 29 check by name and a date of birth for Brian. A 29 check refers to the 10 code of 1029, which is checking for warrants, protective orders, etc. Officer Robbins asked dispatch to run Brian out of Florida. Dispatch returns and states that they are unable to find anyone with that name and date of birth out of Florida. I'm not sure if they also check for a driver's license for Brian as well, or just check the 29 status as requested by Officer Robbins. Officer Robbins asked dispatch for another 29 by name and date of birth, this time for Gabby. Officer Robbins misheard Gabby's last name and misspelled it. Robbins read the incorrect letters back to Gabby and she did not correct Officer Robbins. The last name was relayed to dispatch as being Petito rather than Petito. Officer Robbins asked dispatch to run Gabby out of Florida. Dispatch relays to Officer Robbins that the 29s are 1010 and states there was no 27 driver's license found. When 1010 is used, it means there are no warrants, protective orders, etc. Because of the misspelled name, if there had been a protective order under her name, there's a chance they would have found it. In a subsequent interview with Officer Robbins, I asked Robbins why he didn't verify the information with Gabby after dispatch had told him they were unable to find any driver's license information based on the information Robbins reported to them. Robbins said he didn't know and the driving statuses weren't on my highest priority list. Robbins also added that he may have missed that information as it was busy and it's difficult sometimes to catch everything that is going on in front of you, as well as what's being relayed in your ear by dispatch. Robbins also stated the earpiece he had at the time was not functioning well, and the quality of the audio he was hearing was poor. I explained the importance of finding out driver's license information, especially as it relates to people who are not local, so you can confirm they are who they say they are, as well as ensuring you're gathering and transmitting accurate information. Okay, this one, foreign court orders was unfounded, and the reason is there were no protective orders found between Brian and Gabby. As documented above, there could have been one, and it may not have been found. However, with Brian's correct information relayed, it's likely if there had been a protective order between Brian and Gabby, it should or could have come up when checking Brian's information as well. And this one, verification of court orders, also unfounded. It says this does not apply in this case since no protective orders were located. Okay, this one, 311, the legal mandates and relevant laws and standards for arrest. Officers responding to a domestic violence call shall arrest or issue a citation to a domestic violence offender if there is probable cause to believe that an offense has occurred. The offense need not occur in the officer's presence. Any citation issued shall note that the offense involved a domestic violence offense sustained. Since this has already been previously addressed and responded to in this report under Utah State Code. And B was one that is unfounded. This section does not apply as no court orders were located between the two parties. And C, also unfounded. This has already been previously addressed and responded to in this report. I will, however, note each section above briefly. Section 1, this was not investigated or disclosed by either party. Section 2, no protective order was found. Section 3, this was not investigated or disclosed by either party. 4, this was not investigated or disclosed by either party. 5, this was not disclosed by either party. 6, there was no evidence disclosed or observed that were clear signs that the victim would be subjected to continued violence or abuse. D, also unfounded. This has already been addressed under the Utah State Code section. E, also unfounded. This has already been addressed. F, unfounded. This section does not apply as nobody was arrested either by citation or custody. G, also unfounded. This has already been addressed. H, whether a court order is on file with the law enforcement agency or whether the complainant has a copy of the court order in his or her possession. 2, whether proof of service or prior notice exists, whether the alleged perpetrator was in court when the order was made or it was provided by court ex parte. Number 3, the terms of this court order may be enforced against the alleged perpetrator unfounded. This section does not apply as no court orders were located and none of the involved parties indicated there were any court orders. I, unfounded, this section does not apply. J, unfounded, this section does not apply. Okay, going on down to reports and records. A, reports on all records of domestic violence shall include the Utah Code, the officer's disposition of the case, the appropriate crime classification for domestic violence. If no arrest was made, the report shall detail the grounds for not arresting. If two parties are arrested, the report shall detail the grounds for arresting both parties. Sustained. There was a case report completed regarding this case and it has been identified as Moab Police Case Number as it relates to Utah Code. This has already been addressed previously in the report under the Utah State Code. In the case report, the incident is categorized as a disorderly conduct incident and details the disposition of the case. The classification of this report should have been a domestic violence related category. The report details the grounds for not arresting, and due to there being no arrest, the report does not need to detail grounds for arresting both parties. I have detailed my concerns with the content of the case reports under the section above titled Investigations. And B, this has already been previously addressed. C, unfounded, it has already been previously addressed. D, sustained, this has already been previously addressed. E, unfounded, again, previously addressed. And F is still unfounded. This does not apply. Moab City Police, other applicable sections. Officers should provide all victims with victim information handouts. That was sustained and it has been addressed. Standards of conducts, law, rules, and orders, violation of federal, state, and local administrative laws, rules, and regulations, sustained. As previously described, I believe the officers responded to a domestic violence call and had probable cause that an act of domestic violence had been committed. This should have meant an arrest was made, either by citation or custody. This was a violation of the Utah State Code. Efficiency, neglect of duty, sustained. unsatisfactory work, performance included but not limited to failure, incompetence, inefficiency, or delay of performing and or carrying out proper orders, work assignments, or the instructions of supervisors without a reasonable and bona fide excuse. Sustained. Cause for these determinations have already been addressed previously in the report. Performance. Failure to disclose or misrepresenting material facts, or making any false or misleading statement on any application, examination form, or other official document, report of form, or during the course of any work-related investigation. Sustained. This applies to Officer Robbins' report and the information he put in the report, which was inaccurate or misrepresented, which has already been detailed. Robbins stated himself that he may be guilty of speculation when asked about some of the discrepancies. E. Disparaging remarks or conduct concerning duly sworn authority to the extent that such conduct disrupts the efficiency of this department or subverts the good order, efficiency, and discipline of this department, or that would tend to discredit any of its members. Not sustained. This is in response to complaint number 5 from Tanya Reeves, where it is addressed in further detail. I. Any act on or off duty that brings discredit to this department. Sustained. Call for this determination has already been addressed previously. Report preparation. Employees should ensure that reports are sufficiently detailed for their purpose and free from errors prior to submission. It is the responsibility of the assigned employee to complete and submit all reports taken during the shift before going off duty, unless permission to hold the report has been approved by a supervisor. Generally, reports requiring prompt follow-up action on active leads or arrest reports where the suspect remains in custody should not be held. All reports must accurately reflect the identity of the persons involved. All pertinent information seen, heard, or by anyone other since, and any actions taken. Employees must not suppress, conceal, or distort the facts of any reported incident, nor shall any employee make a false report orally or in writing. Generally, the reporting employee's opinions should not be included in the reports unless specifically identified as such. Sustained. I have already addressed the report writing concerns I had previously in this report. I don't believe the reports were sufficiently detailed as it related to this investigation. Reports and corrections. Supervisors must review reports for content and accuracy. If a correction is necessary, the reviewing supervisor should contact the authoritative officer stating the reasons for rejections. The original report should be returned to the reporting employee for correction as soon as possible. It must be the responsibility of the originating officer to ensure that any report returned for correction is processed in a timely manner. Sustained. Although by the time the report would have made it to a supervisor, wouldn't have changed how the call was handled at the time. A supervisor reviewing the report should have addressed the concerns about the lack of arrest, the lack of details in a report, as well as the lack of follow-up with the reporting party. As part of addressing these concerns, the reporting party should have been contacted so their statement could have been documented as part of the report. Officer Robbins' report was reviewed and sent back for grammatical errors, but I am unaware of there being any content issues addressed by any supervisors reviewing the reports. That is outside of Officer Pratt's addressing the lack of Officer Robbins following up with the original reporting party. Department use of social media, prohibited content. Not sustained. This is in response to complaint number 1 from Tanya Reeves, which I have provided a detailed response under that complaint. Portable audio and video recorders. Activation of the portable recorder. This policy is not intended to describe every possible situation in which the portable recorder should be used, although there are many situations where its use is appropriate. Members should activate the recorder anytime the member believes it would be appropriate or valuable to record an incident. The portable recorder shall be activated in any of the following situations: all enforcement and investigative contacts, including stops and field interview situations. Sustained. There were 2 identified contacts during this incident, both contacts with witness that were not recorded. The first contact by Pratt was after officers were dispatched regarding the incident. The second contact was with Officer Robbins, who responded to witness residence to collect a statement. And according to this policy, the sections I noted above apply to this case. Explanations by both officers regarding the lack of video being activated for these contacts are explained previously in this report. Investigation and prosecution sustained. Cause for this determination has already been addressed previously. And the conclusion. There is one thing I would like to point out that I believe is applicable to this case as well as many domestic violence cases. Just because Gabby was determined to be the predominant aggressor as it related to this incident doesn't mean she was the long-term predominant aggressor in this relationship. Oftentimes in cases of domestic violence, the long-term victim gets to a point emotionally where they defend themselves or act out in such a way where law enforcement is summoned. There have been many times in my career where someone who we know from past experience to be a long-time victim of domestic violence gets arrested for committing an act of domestic violence against their long-term abuser. And despite knowing the history of those involved, we have had to make a decision based on the information provided to law enforcement at the time, and despite our personal feelings and the known history of the relationship, it's very likely that Gabby was a long-term victim of domestic violence, and whether that be physically, mentally, and or emotionally, Gabby had a job which she left in order to travel the country with Brian. Gabby was trying to start an online career which Brian didn't support or believe that she could accomplish. Brian tried locking Gabby out of the van in an attempt to control her movements. Brian said he was trying to make Gabby calm down, and Gabby said she was trying to get Brian to stop telling her to calm down. Gabby also said Brian kept telling her to shut up. So based on the information provided, I can only assume the act of Brian grabbing Gabby's face was his attempt to make Gabby calm down or make her shut up. Although the act of grabbing someone's face, like in this case, rarely causes any significant injury, I find that the specific act of grabbing someone's face is extremely personal, violent, and controlling. And just because there may have been some signs that Brian was the long-term predominant aggressor, law enforcement could only act on the information they were provided. Officer Pratt said, "We're all doing this with the fact in our mind that we know what happened later." So, it's really convoluted and hard to tell you like anything other than what I thought at the time, which was if I missed a big red flag that he was a murderer, then yes, I missed it. If I would have known he was going to murder her, I would have taken vacation to follow them because I care about people to the point where he was going to murder her, and I would have intervened and citizens arrest him in Wyoming. I would have taken my own time. I would have missed my family to go do that. I'm desperately fucked over that she got killed. I really am. I would have done anything to stop it if I would have known that was coming. When speaking with Officer Pratt, I asked him if there was anything else that he thinks I should know or add as it related to this investigation. Pratt said he accepts responsibility for anything that was found that he did wrong in this case. Pratt said, I accept responsibility for it, but I don't want anyone to think that I did not care. I have daughters, and I do want anyone involved to know that I talked to Gabby, and I treated Gabby as much like I could fatherly, the way I would want another cop to interact with my daughter, even if he got it wrong. I do care. I am devastated about it. I cared that day, and I still care. I don't think the public gets that I don't know if they know we care. I don't know if they know. There is a lot of speculation regarding this incident, and I can't answer the what-if questions. There were mistakes made in how this case was handled. If this case was handled flawlessly, would it have changed anything? Nobody knows. More and more in law enforcement, perfection is what is being expected. With that comes officers second-guessing themselves and their decisions. After reviewing all of the information and speaking with the officers, I am confident and comfortable in stating that the mistakes that were made were not made intentionally. The officers did not know what they were doing was wrong at the time and did not make the decision to benefit themselves in any way. They both believed at the time they were making the right decision based on the totality of the circumstances that were presented. The Moab Police Department, and specifically Officer Pratt and Officer Robbins, are responsible for their actions or lack thereof as it pertains to this investigation. However, I find it difficult to assign responsibility to anyone other than the person or persons directly responsible for Gabby's death weeks after and several hundred miles away from their August the 12th incident in Moab. Based on my findings in this report, I would recommend at a minimum the following. Both officers to be placed on probation, or if they are still on probation, that probation be extended. A review of Officer Robbins' FTO program to determine if he needs to complete additional time on field training. Report writing training at least 8 hours. Domestic violence investigation related training at least 8 hours. Legal training. In addition to attending legal training to ensure officers understand the Utah state legal and statutes, I would suggest building a stronger relationship with your local prosecutors to where if they are legal questions that officers are unable to answer, that they are able to and feel comfortable with reaching out for additional guidance. A review to the report approval processes previously in place to determine if more checks and balances are needed. A follow-up with witness to obtain his statement, regardless of how long it has been and whether or not his statement may have tainted due to the coverage of this case. A review of the software used to transfer files to reduce the risk of photographic evidence being lost in the future. Overall policy review, update, applicable policy sections to require photographs of injuries be taken of all of those involved and require asking medical assistance to all of those involved, regardless if they are suspect or victim. Implement an assessment protocol and policy in all domestic violence cases. Everything that I have used as part of this report or documented myself have been included with this report. All of this information will also be placed on a thumb drive for the entirety of the contents of this investigation will be turned over to Moab City Police Department. The Price City Police Department will not retain any of these records. And this is the records that he will be turning over, the ones we just went over. And then the body-worn camera notes. Okay, this is Officer Eric Pratt's, his initial contact with Brian. Pratt told Brian that they had got a call about a male hitting a female and then getting in the vehicle and taking off. And Brian replies, "I don't want to try and defend myself by saying anything here, but I pushed her away. She gets really worked up, and when she does, she swings." Unintelligible, something about hands. So, etc., etc. Okay, then into the initial contact with Gabby. She said that she's having a very stressed morning, says that Brian is her fiancé, asked if he's a good guy, yeah. And she said she was really stressed trying to get work done. She said she was apologizing to him after she had thrown a bunch of stuff in the back of the van. She said she gets so stressed out and has OCD. She says sometimes she has a mean attitude, but she's not trying to be mean about straightening things up. She said she was apologizing, but she guessed I said it in a mean tone. She said Brian got frustrated with her and locked her out of the van and told her to go take a breather. She said she didn't want to. She said she wanted to get going and said they were out of water. She said their goal was to come here and refill with water. Asked what happened after he locked her out and told her to go take a breather. She said he walked away to take his own breather, but she wanted to sit in the car because all of her stuff was in the car. She said that she had been working on something in the car, and that is where she wanted to be. Brian told her to just relax for a second, but she didn't want to relax, so she got real mad. He asked what happened next, and she said she told him to drive to get water because she was really thirsty. He asked about a mark on her cheek and points out a mark on her left arm. He asked to see the other side of her face, and he asked what happened. She said she wasn't sure what happened, stating that it happened really fast. She said she was just trying to get back in the car and said his backpack was what got her. He tells her 2 people reported that Brian hit her and saw Brian punch her. And she said, "To be honest, I definitely hit him first." He asked where she hit Brian, and she said she slapped him. He asked how many times, and she said a couple. She said he kept telling her to shut up. He asked what Brian's reaction was to that, and she said after a pause, "Grab my arm so I wouldn't slap him." He confirms Brian just grabbed her, and she said, "Yeah." He asked, "Did he hit you though?" He emphasized them needing the truth of what happened, and she said, "I guess, but I hit him first." As she is saying this, she is very obviously becoming physically emotional. He asked where Brian hit her, and she said, while demonstrating, that he grabbed my face, I guess. She then goes on to say that he didn't hit me in the face while demonstrating a punch to her other palm. Like he didn't punch me in the face. She said again that he grabbed her face, demonstrating again, and says she can feel there is a cut on her left cheek, stating when she touches it, it burns. Officer Pratt asked if he had been drinking, and she replied, stating, "We don't drink." Officer Pratt asked what was with the driving, as Officer Robbins saw the van hit the curb, and she replied, "I hit him." Officer Pratt says, "While he was driving?" And she confirms she was hitting him while he was driving, but not a lot, but yeah. She said it was only for a second, and she saw the police car, and she demonstrated throwing a punch. She said it was when she saw the lights on the police car, she hit him, demonstrating again by throwing a punch, and said, "You're so stupid." Officer Pratt asked if she is okay and asked if she takes any medication for anxiety or anything, and she said no. She said she just goes to yoga. She confirms she has a lot of anxiety and has OCD. Officer Pratt asked if Brian usually has a lot of patience with her, and she said, "Yeah, but I get it makes me upset. I know he definitely gets frustrated with me a lot because I have a lot of anxiety, and he definitely has anxiety too." Officer Pratt relates to her and gives an example of his current relationship compared with his prior relationship, and how if two people both have a lot of anxiety, they can feed off of each other and things spiral. He tells her he's not trying to tell her how to live her life, but told her to look at the situation she is currently in. Second contact with Brian. Officer Pratt asks Brian if he wants to stand in the shade. He confirms that they haven't been drinking, which Brian agreed. Officer Pratt said after talking with Gabby, initially they were worried about what kind of a guy that Brian was, but now it's not so clear cut. He points out the marks that were noticed on Brian's neck and said there were marks on Gabby as well. Officer Pratt asked Brian to explain what happened to Officer Robbins, and he goes and looks into the cab of the van and walks back to where Brian is explaining what happened. He gets a drink from the female officer on scene and takes it back to Gabby. Second contact with Gabby. Officer Pratt takes Gabby a Gatorade and asks if she prefers water. Gabby apologized and said she only drinks water, and he goes and grabs her water. He is met up by the female officer park ranger, who asks if Officer Pratt is concerned with the story. He said he wasn't, said she seemed like a sweet girl with a lot of anxiety, and explains that from Gabby's story, she is the primary aggressor. The female park ranger confirms the circumstances explained by Brian, also shows Gabby is the primary aggressor. Officer Pratt said he would love to talk with the independent witness. He gives the water to Gabby and returns to Brian, who is speaking with officers. Third contact with Brian. He returns and is on his phone and appears to get the information from one of the independent witnesses and returns to his vehicle to make a phone call to witness. First contact with witness 1. The witness describes seeing them arguing a bit, and something that caught his attention was they were possibly fighting over a phone. Believes it was her phone, and he was trying to keep her from getting in the van. She said something like, "Why are you being so mean?" He got into the driver's seat, and she was also trying to get in through the same door. She hit him a few times, more like play fighting, nothing like slugs to the face. He felt something was off, and he had a weird vibe about it. She forced her way in the vehicle over his lap. They then drove away, and he wasn't confident in the nature of the argument. Said it was some sort of disagreement and wasn't sure why she went through the driver's door and thought that was strange. He thought something else was calling it in. 14:20 into the video. Officer Pratt asked if he ever saw the male strike the female. The witness was hesitant and said he maybe saw a push or a shove, but nothing like a full-on punch to the face or anything. Officer Pratt asked if the shove was an aggressive action or a defensive maneuver. The witness wasn't sure and said that was a very good question. He wasn't entirely sure what was going on, but said it appeared to him that Brian was trying to close off the passenger side of the vehicle and close things up. Put a backpack or something on the back of the vehicle, I'm not sure. Brian was stepping in and she was out trying to get in. He said he didn't see anything that was him kicking after her or hitting her or vice versa. He said it was kind of light and they were laughing, and he wasn't sure if they were just joking around, but it got more strange as he got in the vehicle and about to drive off. And Officer Pratt said, "You did see her slapping him, it sounds like." And he said, "Yes, my memory is he was in the driver's seat and had the driver's door open, and she was like kind of hitting him near the arm or maybe in the face with an open hand and was saying to let her in. Officer Pratt thanks him for the independent story, which helped them figure out what was going on. Officer Pratt asks about a written statement, which the witness agrees to and states that he would get it written down now before his memory fades. He reminded Officer Pratt he was just casually observing and something seemed off, and talked about it being a bad situation. Officer Pratt makes arrangements for a statement and hangs up the phone. Contact with Officer Robbins. Officer Pratt explains the story to Officer Robbins, stating the witness's statement matches Gabby's statement to include he never saw him hit her, but saw him push her, but didn't know if it was in defense of what she was doing or as an aggressive action. Officer Pratt said she climbed over him to get into the vehicle as she was locked out. Officer Pratt explains that unless the male is claiming he is at fault, that the female is the primary aggressor in this situation. Officer Pratt explains that the law states in incidents of domestic violence that they shall arrest. Officer Pratt explains that doesn't necessarily mean someone needs to go to jail, stating they could release with a citation, with one of the stipulations being that they can ensure the safety of the victim. Officer Pratt states the problem with that is they live in the same vehicle. Officer Pratt also points out the injury to Brian, the victim. Officer Robbins' statement. Officer Robbins said he was getting conflicting stories on what happened when they hit the curb. Officer Robbins described what he first observed was the van crossed the double yellow line when the officer was going 42 miles per hour and he was about 2 car lengths behind. Officer Robbins states he was tapping his well, his siren, to get their attention and said they knew that he was behind them. The van merged into the right lane and out of nowhere went right into the curb. Brian told Officer Robbins that Gabby grabbed the wheel and turned it real hard, where Gabby said she was hitting Brian in the arm. Officer Pratt states that the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, and Brian may be scared to say that she hit him for fear of her going to jail, so it was easier to say that she grabbed the wheel. Officer Pratt tells Officer Robbins that they're going to have to charge her, and he states that there could be a citation if there is an arrangement that could be made to separate them. Officer Pratt states they also need to explain to them the no contact order that would be in place and also inform Brian how to waive the protective order at the Moab Police Department. Officer Pratt said they should go speak with Brian first regarding what they needed to do. Fourth contact with Brian. Officer Pratt asked Officer Robbins about getting pictures. Officer Pratt then explains to Brian discretion when it comes to their job, and in Utah they don't have the discretion when it comes to domestic violence cases. Officer Pratt brings up the incident witnesses who validate the story and also brought up there being another witness who would also likely validate the story. Officer Pratt explains that even if Brian didn't want to pursue any charges, law enforcement doesn't have a choice. Officer Pratt talked about the challenges with their circumstance as they lived together in a van. They're from Florida and the difficulty in separating them. Officer Pratt explains they don't want to take her to jail because of her stature and his ability to defend himself, but again explains that they can't discriminate because she's a suspect and a female. They can't treat it any different than if it was the other way around. Officer Pratt asked Brian if he has any ideas on how to separate them and asked if he has any friends in the area. Brian asked, "Well, can I go to jail?" And Officer Pratt said no, because we don't have a charge for you. And Brian points to Officer Robbins' waistband and joked about taking his radio. Pratt explains to Brian that he could go to the police department during business hours and fill out a waiver to drop the no contact order so they can be together. Officer Pratt explains that Gabby will have a court date online, and from there, it's up to the prosecutor. Brian said he did not want to pursue anything, stating Gabby was his fiancée and he loves her, and it was a little squabble. Brian states he wanted a checklist of things to do and wanted to get rid of this. Brian talks about wanting to get rid of it completely, and Officer Pratt explains the court process and the expectations of what may happen. Officer Pratt brings up again that officers had to follow the law, but the prosecutor could still potentially dismiss the case. Officer Pratt restates again that the first court appearance must happen and Gabby would need to play ball and making sure she attends and talks about it being good for them since they are traveling and could do it online. Brian said, "Me and her are a team," and apologized again for the situation. Officer Pratt confirms there would be an online court date. Officer Pratt again explains that there will be a no contact order in place, and until Brian went into the police department to sign the waiver, the no contact order would be in place. Officer Pratt explains what a no contact order means and explains the process to waive it if he so chooses. Officer Pratt brings up the problem with what to do with her, stating they need to be able to separate them. They explain the option of having one of them getting a hotel room and then staying separated until Brian can go to the police department the following day and fill out the waiver. Officer Pratt asks if Brian has friends in the area where one of them could stay, which Brian said they don't. Officers explain the charge, the difference in booking her into jail and just releasing her with a citation, and they talk about the potential charge of violating the no contact order if she were to communicate with him before it is waived. Brian asks if Gabby can take the van and if they would be able to drop him off somewhere. And officers ask about her license, and Brian states she has one. Brian asks about being dropped off at Delicate Arch, and officers explain to him the problem with that would be him having to walk clear back into town to sign the waiver the next day and having to do that before noon since everyone in the office leaves at noon on Fridays. They talked about since Brian is determined to be the victim of a domestic violence assault, that they had somewhere they would take him in to stay the night at no charge. Officer Pratt walks away and speaks with Gabby again after getting some water. Thank you so much for listening. We would truly appreciate a thumbs up or even a thumbs down if you feel so inclined. And until next time, this is Unjustified.